Hey everyone, Brian from Human Japanese and Satori Reader here. Have you ever encountered a Japanese sentence made up of two parts where the first part ended not with the te form like you might expect, but instead with the mas stem? For example, here's a really simple sentence that you might learn while you're studying conversational Japanese. 公園に行って友達に会った. I went to the park and met a friend. And notice that that first half ends with the te form of iku, itte. Well, after you start reading, you might encounter that same sentence like this. 公園に行き、友達に会った. So now the verb iku is appearing in the mas stem form, iki. So that might naturally make you wonder, what's going on here? Are these two forms totally equivalent? Are they interchangeable? And the short answer is, when the relationship of the parts is A and B, or A and then B, yes, they are totally interchangeable, except for the fact that the te form is the ordinary and natural way to connect those phrases in speech, whereas the mas stem is going to be much more common in writing, perhaps the narration portion of a novel, for example, or in very formal speech. But for ordinary everyday speech, it would be the te form instead. So that's the nutshell version. However, there are a few gotchas, and there are some things that the te form can do either better than the mas stem, or that the mas stem can't do at all. So what I'd like to do is just walk you through a few example sentences, and by the time we're done, you'll understand everything perfectly. Sound good? All right, so to get started, let me give a quick shout out to Kale L, who is the reader on Satori Reader who most recently asked this question and prompted this video. So Kale, I hope this is useful to you and to everyone else who's watching as well. All right, so let's get started. Just to make sure we're on the same page, let's just review a few of the things that the te form can do. Early on in all of our studies, we met the wonderful te form. It's sort of the basic ingredient in many different patterns. But one of the most important things the te form can do is to connect two phrases. And when it does so, the relationship of those two phrases is usually one of three things. It's A and B, simply two facts being presented side by side, or A and then B, where two things happen in chronological order, sometimes more than two, but we're just going to go with two for this video. And the third one is A and therefore B, where a causal link is implied. So let's look at examples of each one. Try this sentence on for size. 兄がピアノを弾いて、妹が歌った. My older brother played the piano, and my younger sister sang. So here we just have two facts sitting side by side. Perhaps this was for a particular piece that was performed at a party or something. Try this sentence. 彼はドアを開けて部屋に入った. He opened the door and entered the room. So here we have A and then B. He opens the door, and then what happens next is he enters the room. And finally, try this sentence. 鈴木さんは弁護士でとても忙しい人です. Suzuki-san is a lawyer, and he or she is a very busy person. Now, there's no causal link explicitly present there. There's no kara or node or anything like that. But clearly, these two parts are intended to be interpreted in a causal relationship. He or she is a lawyer, and therefore he or she is very busy. And actually, in English, it works the same way. If you were to say, my friend Suzuki is a lawyer and she's very busy, it's pretty clear that you mean that she's busy because she's a lawyer, right? And so the Japanese works the same way there. So we can call these three patterns the big three when it comes to joining two phrases with the te form. The te form can do one other really important thing that I want to talk about in a moment. But first, let's jump into the mas stem side of things and see how it compares if it can do these three things just as well. First off, I just want to make sure everyone understands exactly what I mean when I say mas stem. I'm using that term because it's pretty widely used and understood. And all it means is if you were to take the mas form of a verb and chop off the mas, what you would be left with is the mas stem. So for example, if you take the verb taberu, to eat, the mas form is tabemasu. So if we cut off the mas, we're left with tabe. And if we take the verb yomu, to read, the mas form is yomimasu. So again, if we chop off the mas, we have yomi. Now this form goes by a lot of different names because it's very important in Japanese. Some other names that you might hear it go by are simply the verb stem. In fact, that's what we call it in Satori Reader. You might also hear it called the continuative because it allows one phrase to end and then the next phrase to continue. It helps that continuation. And in Japanese, the technical term for this is renyo-kei. And this is a very common word. It's one of those few grammar words that most people still remember from school. And it shows up in dictionaries a lot. So it's probably a good word to add to your repertoire if you don't have it yet. So in the rest of this video, I'm just going to kind of weave it in a little bit. But all of those things mean the same thing. Mas stem, verb stem, renyo-kei, and continuative. All right? Okay, so let's get back to our discussion. We were saying that the mas stem, the renyo-kei, can be used equivalently to the te form when combining phrases. So let's take a look at some of those phrases we saw earlier and just convert them to use the mas stem instead. So try this one on. 兄がピアノを弾き、妹が歌った. My older brother played the piano and my younger sister sang. Okay, so instead of hite, here we now have hiki. The verb is hiku, and the mas form would be hikimasu. So the continuative or the verb stem, the mas stem, is hiki. All right? Try this sentence. 彼はドアを開け、部屋に入った. So he opened the door and then he entered the room. And notice it's ake, not akete. The verb is akeru. The mas form is akemasu. Akemasu. So if we cut off the mas, we're left with ake. Make sense? Now you may have noticed that I haven't given you an example yet for the a and therefore b pattern of the mas stem. And the reason for that is while it's not impossible for it to mean that, the te form is much, much better at indicating that kind of a relationship. You should think of the mas stem as being very neutral, a neutral presentation of facts. This and this, or this and then this. So even in writing, if an author wants to say this and therefore this, they might choose to use the te form instead because that link is just more strongly visible. All right, so we've started to see where the usage of the te form and the mas stem have diverged a little bit. Now let's take a look at something that only the te form can do, that the mas stem can definitely not. And that is to name the manner in which the next part of the sentence happens. So here's a really simple example. 彼女は歩いて帰りました. She walkingly returned home, or in other words, she walked home. This aruite part doesn't mean she walked and she returned home, or she walked and then she returned home, and certainly not she walked and therefore she returned home. I'm not sure what that could even mean. Instead, the walking is the manner in which the returning home happened. And only the te form can do that. If we were to try to use the renyo-kei instead, the mas stem, we would get 彼女は歩き帰りました. And it just feels a little strange because the only real way to interpret that would be she walked and she returned home. So like, did she walk home, or were those two separate events? It feels a little bit awkward there. 歩いて帰りました makes it clear that's the manner in which the returning home happens. Here's another example. 時間がなかったので急いで食べた. So, isoide is the te form of isogu, to hurry. So this means I didn't have time, so I hurryingly ate. The hurrying is the way that the eating happens. So if we were to change this to the mas stem instead, we would get 時間がなかったので急ぎ食べた. And while it's not grammatically wrong per se, it feels like they're two different things. I hurried and then I ate, when the author actually means that the hurrying is the way that the eating happened. Does that make sense? So let's review really quick. We've seen that for the relationships A and B, or A and then B, the mas stem, the continuative, the nenyo-kei, that form that takes so many different names, can be used equivalently to the te form, except that it sounds very much like writing or very formal speech. And we saw that when the relationship is A and therefore B, the te form has that causal link a lot more clearly. It's not impossible for the mas stem, but the te form would be preferred for that. And finally, when the relationship is A-ingly B, that the te form is really the only way to represent that. So even in the narration portion of a book or in formal speech, the author or speaker would still use the te form there. Okay? So as you go forward, keep these principles in mind, and I think everything should make sense to you. And if you're looking for Japanese reading material to put these principles to the test, then please check out satorireader.com. We work really hard to produce intermediate-friendly Japanese reading material with this sort of discussion baked in. And if you're still working on the basics of Japanese, the foundations, then check out our Human Japanese series as well. Either way, I hope you enjoyed the video, and we'll see you next time.